Okay, continuing with the sketching of graphs, we now want to sketch the graph 1 over x. So again, we're going to consider exactly the same things that we did for the cubic. First of all, what happens when I try to find a root of a factor? In this case, I just have a single factor on the bottom, x. What happens when that is 0? Well, x would be 0. But in this case, I'm not going to have a root at 0 because we have here what we call a reciprocal function. Remember, it's been flipped. Reciprocal means flipped. If I tried to divide 1 by 0, I can't do it. So in fact, we have what we call an asymptote at this point. I'm going to draw that on, dotted line. And that's telling us a set of values that we cannot have. Just like when we use dotted lines on the combining inequalities video, if we can't have a value, we like to draw a dotted line to help us represent that. What else did we consider for the cubics? We considered what happens for very large positive values of x. If x is very large and positive, 1 divided by a large positive number will be very, very small, but still positive, so I must be the correct side of the x-axis. What happens when I divide by a very large but negative number? I'll get a very small but negative value. Again, making sure you're the right side of the axis is important. I tried to set x to 0 to find a y-intercept. I can't do it. If we try to set y to 0, there's nothing I can divide 1 by to get 0. So there will be no y-intercepts. That tells me I should not cross there should be no x-intercepts, I should not cross the x-axis. So let's consider what happens as I approach this asymptote. What happens when I divide by numbers which are very, very close to 0, but not 0? Well, again, we're going to consider when that happens when it's positive and when it's negative. If I divide by a very, very small but positive number, such as 1 divided by 0.001, that's going to give me 1,000. So in fact, if we divide by a very small but positive number, we get a very large and positive number, somewhere up here. Again, if I think what happens when I divide by a very small but negative number, I get a very large but negative number. So on the negative side of 0, I should be here. Now again, we're just going to join our points with a nice smooth curve. So our graph in the positive, we call this the first quadrant, should look like this, and in the negative, second, third quadrant, it will look like that. Again, never quite reaching our asymptote, but getting as close as we want to it. So if we were to write down the equations of the two asymptotes to this graph, one was at x equals 0, as x can never equal 0, and the other would be y equals 0. Again, there's an asymptote there, as there's no x value we can put in to get y is 0. Okay? Similar idea for when we're sketching y equals 1 over x squared. Set x to 0, try and find a y-intercept. We can't divide by 0, but that does tell us that we have an asymptote. Try to set y to 0. There's no number I can divide 1 by to get 0. We have another asymptote. And now we're actually going to try and sketch this. So again, when x is large and positive, 1 divided by a large positive value squared will be large and positive. 1 divided by a very large but negative x value squared will be very, very small, but importantly positive now. Remember, anything squared is positive. What happens when I try to divide by a number very, very close to 0? 1 divided by a very small number, positive number squared, will still be positive, but large. 1 divided by a very small negative number squared, remember negative things squared become positive again. And again, we're going to join up with a nice smooth curve that is what our graph would look like. It's supposed to be symmetrical. Unfortunately, I've just drawn this axis a little bit longer. If I shorten the axis, we can see that they should look vaguely symmetrical. Remembering again, it's only a sketch. As long as you get the basic shape correct, that's all that we're looking for.